On Friday, we will know who is in, who is out, how a new look government will look like. Politicians from most parties currently locked away in talks about who will team up with you and, of course, which policies they are willing to compromise on in an effort to share power. And while there's been much talk of coalitions between the ANC and the DA on one hand, or even perhaps the ANC, EFF and others, the big plan is to create a government of national unity. That's what Cyril Ramaphosa said last week in an address after an ANC NEC meeting. But what is the difference between a government of national unity, a grand coalition, a partnership agreement, or a supply and confidence agreement? That's what we've been talking about a lot also recently. We are seeing reports that the ANC is planning to use a national dialogue as somewhat of a springboard to lock its government of national unity partners into a 5-year agreement to ensure that there is a stability of government. Jaap Visser is the National Research Chair in Multi-Level Government at the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape. Good morning, Jaap. Exciting times for South Africa. We have been here before, 1994, the first 2 years of a democratic dispensation in South Africa had a government of national unity. But for many South Africans, hearing conversations about coalitions, governments of national unity, supply and confidence agreements is something new and novel. We've not been here in South Africa in a very long time. For a scholar in governance, this must be a very interesting time for you.
No, it is. And good morning, Lester. It is a very interesting time. And to start off on a positive note, our main institutions have held the IEC, the Chief Justice, Parliament. They've been strong over the last week and a half. So I think we can be inspired by that.
So let's look at what options are presented to the political leaders who have to decide how we are going to agree, make concession, maybe even amend some ideas and policies, offer positions, and how we are going to form a government. If you could explain to a lay listener, or maybe even one of your students, for example, what would be the key difference between some form of grand coalition of political parties to form a government and what we call a GNU, a government of national unity?
Yes, well, it's all a little bit, what's in the name kind of discussion. But, a grand coalition generally refers to a coalition across the political spectrum where unlikely candidates, so to speak, that are on opposing ends of the ideological spectrum still come together to form a coalition. It's a bit different from the government of national unity. When that concept was presented by the president, I think he was sort of trying to invoke the spirit of 1994 when we had a government of national unity. But that was very different because that was instructed by the Constitution. The interim Constitution at the time said that any party with more than 20 seats in Parliament would be entitled to be part of cabinet in proportion to the seats that they had in Parliament. So that was an instruction by the Constitution. And as a result, at the time, the ANC, the National Party, and the IFP qualified, and they then formed a government of national unity. And of course, a little bit later, the National Party opted out of it again. What happened now is more sort of an open invitation by the president for any party that's willing to join the ANC in a grand coalition or a government of national unity, if you want to call it that. And some parties have indicated their willingness to join, and other parties have indicated that they're not willing to join. So it's not really the same concept as we had under the interim constitution. It's more maybe now, edging more towards a regular coalition. Certainly, if it's going to be limited to the ANC, the DA, and the IFP, and maybe one or two smaller parties, then we don't really have a government of national unity.
I appreciate what you're saying, what's in a name. Because could it also be possible that political leaders would also want to couch in what form of agreement or arrangement they find themselves in, purely based on the level of oppositional politics in a very brutal and hard-fought election, whether you're calling them doomsday coalitions or only we could rescue South Africa. By entering into negotiations, into some sort of agreement, you also want to save face amongst your base. So whether you call it a GNU or whether you call it a coalition or whether you simply say, you know what, we're partnering for the sake of stability, it's also still about appeasing your base to make sure that you aren't perceived to be fully in bed with a political party you called the enemy over the last 6 months in a run-up to an election.
Yes, I agree, and that may be the smartness of the move of the ANC to issue this open call for political parties to join, perhaps knowing full well that parties like the MK Party and the EFF would perhaps not be so keen to join if the DA is joining, and so some parties would be in and some parties would be out, and maybe this was all a calculated move on the part of the ANC to not sort of openly choose partners that would upset their base.
When we're talking about the composition of an executive, the way I read the Constitution, that the only real executive position within in the framework of the Constitution is the President and the National Executive, the Cabinet, and the form, the makeup, the composition of the Cabinet. That is purely the prerogative of the President. How many ministers, even how many deputy presidents we have. There's a News 24 article this morning saying that the IFP's Vilinkosi Hlabisa to be tipped as a second deputy president in a government of national unity. Is that all under the purview of the president, with consultation, of course, seeing that it's all about intense negotiations, of how an executive, how a cabinet is formed, whether it's one deputy, whether it's two deputies, whether there's no deputies at all?
Yes, that is within the prerogative of the president. Of course, before this election, there was a full prerogative of the president in the sense that he had the backing of a majority in parliament, so could make the choices that he wanted to make, relying on the majority in parliament to support him. Now he will have the prerogative. He will most likely be elected as president if we look at the numbers and how the electoral procedure will work, and the absence of a coherent sort of opposition that would field a candidate that opposes him and be successful. If you look at all of that, it's very likely that former President Ramaphosa will be elected again as president, and then he can form a cabinet. And can choose ministers, deputy ministers, and one or two deputy presidents. But of course, the prerogative only lasts for as long as there is no motion of no confidence passed by the majority of the National Assembly in him. So once he's elected on Friday, he can put together a cabinet, and then we have a government. But then the first test will come the moment that big decisions need to be taken in Parliament. For example, the passing of a bill, a budget, but perhaps also, a motion of no confidence stabled in him. Then he needs to make sure that he has his ducks in a row and that he has not made any decisions in terms of composing that cabinet that upsets one or two of the partners that then pull out and vote with the opposition, because then he's back to square one.
A lot has been said and also debunked about the MK Party's initial plan of them saying, well, we're not going to have our MPs being sworn in, and that will mean that the National Assembly doesn't quorate, and therefore Parliament will essentially collapse. And yourself and other constitutional scholars says, well, that is actually not the case, that Parliament still quorates, even though the MK Party says it will not attend the sitting with the 58 MPs or the 58 seats. But what happens if the MK Party decides to essentially boycott Parliament in perpetuity, that it won't have their 58 MPs sworn in? Does this pose problems further down the line, not just for what we'll see on Friday with the first sitting, but could it pose problems further down the line if the MK says we simply won't allow our MPs to be sworn in?
Well, just looking Purely at at the technicalities of how the Constitution regulates this, it doesn't need to pose a problem. Of course, it's a very unseemly situation and really not what the Constitution intends, and also what the electorate intended by casting a vote for the MK party. Obviously, the assumption is that you would expect the party that you vote for to take up the seats in Parliament. But in terms of the ability of the National Assembly to function, to transact business, so to speak, it simply needs to have a quorum, which is 50% plus one, to pass bills, and it needs to have a quorum of 1/3 to deal with any other matter, including the election of office bearers. And that number can quite easily be met without the 58 MK party members. So yeah, in principle, there's no problem, but of course it will present a real challenge in terms of how our parliament and our constitutional democracy functions if such a large contingent of MPs completely opts out of participating in the National Assembly.
Jaap, Visser, National Research Chair in Multi-Level Government at the Dullah Omar Institute. Really appreciate your time.